Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on meeting the ACNC governance standards. My name is April Kitchener, and I'm from the ACNC's education team. With me today is Zane Worthington from the ACNC's advice team. We will be presenting today's webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone.
We also have Anne Duffy and Carolyn Doyle with us, who will be answering any questions you have along the way. Just a few notes before we start. Throughout the presentation, you can ask a question at any time in the GoToWebinar panel on your screen. Anne and Carolyn will be able to answer your questions directly and privately. If they think the answer would be useful for everyone though, they can also respond in a way that allows everyone to see the question and answer, but not who asked it. Please let us know if you'd like your question to remain private. Also, if there are any questions today we can't answer, we'll provide answers later via email. We will send a follow-up email to all attendees after the webinar with useful links and information from the session. So there's no need to try and write down all of the website addresses you see throughout the presentation. The follow-up email will include them. If you have any difficulties with the sound on your computer, try calling the phone number listed in the GoToWebinar control panel. Finally, we value any suggestions you have to improve our webinars in the future. So please pass on your suggestions in the survey at the end of the session.
The purpose of this webinar is to explain what the ACNC governance standards are, how they apply, and what charities can do to make sure that they are meeting them. We will cover these four important topics. To begin, we will look at what we mean by governance and briefly explain what it looks like for charities. We will then talk through each of the governance standards and what they require of charities. We'll consider some examples developed from a range of real cases that demonstrate some of the challenges charities have with meeting them. We'll also provide some examples of steps you can take to meet the standards, and finally, we'll look at some of the common issues that our compliance team has observed with charities over the last couple of years.
So what do we mean when we talk about governance? There are many different definitions proposed for the meaning of governance. The ACNC suggests that governance refers to the processes, activities, and relationships of your charity that make sure that your charity is effectively and properly run. Governance plays a central role in the life of charities, but how it looks in practice will vary. Some of the common examples of governance activities charities are involved with are holding meetings to make sure that your members are kept informed about your charity's activities, setting a strategy and monitoring the work of an organisation to ensure that it aligns with the strategy, and documenting roles and responsibilities of the people involved with the organisation.
Now let's look at the ACNC's governance standards. The governance standards are the minimum requirements for charities governance. The standards help charities to operate responsibly and to continue to do their charitable work. They also help us to build public trust and confidence in the charity. They are not a description of best practices in governance, but rather a set of minimum standards that all charities must meet. Charities must meet the ACNC's governance standards to register with the ACNC and to remain registered. The governance standards are set out in the ACNC's regulations. These standards are additional to other requirements that your charity may have. For example, the ACNC governance standards do not require incorporated associations to hold annual general meetings, but other state or territory laws may do so. Also, meeting these standards aren't the only obligations of charities. The ACNC has other requirements, such as submitting an annual information statement and keeping records of activities and finances. You should make sure that you are aware of all of the obligations that your charity is required to meet and meet them. It is worth pointing out that there is a very specific category of charities that are not required to meet the governance standards called basic religious charities. To be considered as a basic religious charity, an organisation must meet some very specific requirements. It is a very small category and most religious charities don't fit into them. We won't go into details of being a basic religious charity today, but there is detailed information on our website at acnc.gov.au/basic religious charity. Now let's look at each of the governance standards. April, can you take us through governance standard 1, please?
Thanks, Zane. The first governance standard is about the purposes and not-for-profit character of a charity. This standard requires charities to demonstrate that their purposes and character are not for profit, comply with their purposes and character, and provide information about their charitable purposes to the public. So what does it mean to be a not-for-profit? A not-for-profit is an organization that does not operate for the profit, personal gain, or other benefit of particular people. For example, its members, the people who run it, or their friends or relatives. Your charity's purposes and character may be demonstrated in its governing documents. For example, if a charity's constitution stated that it had the purpose of relieving poverty and it pursued that purpose, the charity would satisfy this part of the standard. However, some charities may not have conventional governing documents and may need to demonstrate their purposes and character through other means. You must show your charity is complying with its purposes and not-for-profit character. This means that you need to be able to show that your charity is doing what it claims to be doing and operating as a not-for-profit should. The steps you must take to comply with this depend on factors such as your size and the extent to which you receive donations, grants, and money from the public. For example, if your charity collects donations, the ACNC would expect it to have an accounting system in place to ensure the money is directed at your charitable purpose. If your charity is making payments to responsible persons or their associates for services, the ACNC would expect it to be able to show the payments are at arm's length and not excessive. If your charity is transferring significant amounts of money overseas to provide humanitarian aid, for example, it must demonstrate that the assistance was delivered as intended. That is, that the assistance went towards its charitable purpose and in a not-for-profit manner. It must show that it wasn't diverted for purposes such as private benefit or, at the extreme, to fund terrorist activities. Finally, you must make information about your purposes public. The ACNC requires all charities to publish their governing documents on the ACNC register. Doing this will satisfy the relevant part of this standard. Zane, can you take us through a case study on this standard, please?
Sure can. Just want to remind you that while the case studies we will give in this webinar are inspired by real cases, they are not de-identified examples of compliance cases. These are examples only. Take, for example, a medium-sized charity that is fundraising in several different states and territories in Australia. Through its fundraising, it generates significant amounts of money. The charity did not appear to be undertaking any charitable activities, but was making significant payments to the charity's responsible persons, so that is the members of its board. We were alerted to this issue and, through our investigations, determined that the charity was not complying with its purposes and character as a not-for-profit. It was in breach of the Governance Standard 1. It appeared that the charity's true purpose was to raise money to provide payment to the charity's board members. This is not to say that the charity cannot pay its responsible persons. They absolutely can. But it must be able to show that these payments are not excessive or made at arm's and that they are made at arm's length. This is so that the ACNC can be confident that the charity only exists for a charitable purpose and that it is meeting the requirements under Governance Standard 1.
Thanks, Zane. Now we'll look at Governance Standard 2. This standard requires charities to be accountable and transparent to its members. This standard only applies to charities that have members, for example, incorporated associations and companies limited by guarantee. It does not apply to charitable trusts. If a charity is already meeting the requirements of incorporated associations legislation in a state or territory, it will also be complying with this standard. And if a charity is a company registered under the Corporations Act 2001 and meets requirements under that Act, it would also be complying with the standard. In fact, because those Corporations Act obligations are now switched off for charities, this standard increases the flexibility of charities that are companies to decide how best to be accountable to their members. For example, charities that are companies no longer have to hold annual general meetings, although you may still decide to hold meetings to comply with this standard, or your governing document may require you to hold AGMs. Zane, we had some questions from people when they signed up to attend the webinar about whether charities that are companies registered with ASIC still need to comply with the Corporations Act or just the governance standards. Can you clarify that for us?
I can. So with the introduction of the ACNC Act, and the governance standards, a number of provisions in the Corporations Act no longer apply to registered charities that are incorporated as companies. These generally relate to the obligations under the Corporations Act which have equivalent or similar obligations under the ACNC Act. Broadly speaking, there are 4 obligations in the Corporations Act that no longer apply to charities. Number 1 is that charities are no longer required to provide certain notifications to ASIC when they change their constitution, company address, or directors. Similar or equivalent obligations now exist within the ACNC Act. Number 2, charities now report their financial information, if required, to the ACNC rather than to ASIC. Number 3, certain civil directors' duties in the Corporations Act have been switched off, and instead the governance standards requires charities to make sure that its directors are subject to and comply with some equivalent duties. And number 4, and finally, the requirements in the Corporations Act relating to meetings of members with, 4, and finally, the requirement in the Corporations Act relating to meetings of members have been switched off. Instead, Governance Standard 2 requires a charity to be accountable to members, but does not stipulate exactly how this is to be done. That's a very quick rundown of the changes in the Corporations Act, and the ACNC has a fact sheet for companies limited by guarantee which goes through this in a lot more detail and explains exactly which obligations have moved from ASIC to the ACNC. You can find this at acnc.gov.au/CLG.
Thanks, Zane. So some things you could do to meet Governance Standard 2 are hold meetings with your members, such as an annual general meeting or a special general meeting. Ensure that members have the opportunity to ask questions and raise concerns about the way a meeting is run. Make sure that you are providing suitable notice periods before meetings so that everyone involved in your charity has a reasonable opportunity to attend. Have a minimum quorum for meetings, that is a minimum number of people that must be present in order for a meeting to go ahead. Run fair and transparent elections for the appointment of the members of your charity's responsible persons, and provide members with an annual report that includes financial information and information about a charity's work towards achieving its purpose. So let's consider another case study. This time, a charity that runs a centre for people who are experiencing homelessness. The charity was brought to our attention because its members had concerns about the governance of the charity. The charity's website had been taken down by a former responsible person, a board member. This person resigned but had the login details for the charity's website and took it offline. After that, almost no information about the charity was available to members. Through our investigation, we found that the board was working hard to get the website back online and was making changes to improve governance within the charity. The charity was taking positive steps, but it was failing to keep its members informed of their activities. This highlights how important it is to be accountable to your members, especially in difficult circumstances or if a charity is undergoing a period of change.
Governance Standard 3 requires charities comply with Australian law. Note that a charity does not need to be actually charged with an indictable offence or given a penalty to be in breach of this governance standard. For example, if the ACNC reasonably believes it is more than likely that a charity has engaged in an offence of fraud, the charity would be in breach of this standard. The ACNC could take action, for example, by issuing a formal warning without the need for a prosecution to be completed. This allows the ACNC to protect a charity from potential ongoing misuse while legal proceedings are being finalised.
So Governance Standard 4 requires charities to ensure that people on its governing body, that is, its board or committee, are suitable. This means that they must not be disqualified from managing a corporation or disqualified from being a responsible person by the ACNC. Although the ACNC and ASIC can disqualify people and will list these persons on their respective registers, people can also be automatically disqualified from managing corporations. When this occurs, they will not necessarily be listed on the ACNC or ASIC registers. Two examples of matters that will result in automatic disqualification are if the person is convicted of an offence in contravention of the Corporations Act 2001, or of an offence involving dishonesty and is punishable by imprisonment of at least 3 months, or if the person is an undischarged bankrupt. It's important that you're aware of how someone can be automatically disqualified and consider the impact this might have on the eligibility of your board members to be responsible persons.
There are a number of steps that you can take to make sure that a charity is meeting governance standard 4. As a first step, you should check with ASIC and AC&C registers of disqualified persons to ensure that none of your charity's responsible persons appear. It may also be a good idea to ask the responsible person to sign a declaration which states that they are not currently disqualified from managing a corporation. As mentioned, there are some things that may automatically disqualify you, and that if they become ineligible, that they will notify the charity. Of course, if any of your responsible persons do not meet these requirements, you will need to take the steps to remove them. It's a good idea to start with asking them to stand aside, but if not, it may be necessary to take further steps.
Our last standard, Governance Standard 5, is the most significant of the standards for what it requires charities to do, and due to the number of issues we see in charities. This governance standard requires the charity to make sure its responsible persons follow 7 duties. Zane, I'll let you take us through these duties, please.
Thanks, April. These duties come from the common law and they have a well-established meaning. So the first duty requires that responsible persons exercise a degree of care and diligence in their roles. This may include reading a charity's papers, turning up for meetings on time, making sure that they're appropriately informed about any matter on which they are required to make a decision. Duty number 2 requires that a responsible person always acts honestly and fairly, and importantly, in the best interest of the charity. When you become a board member for a charity, you accept a duty to act in its best interests. You must ensure that you are always doing so when acting as a board member, and that you do so in a way that is consistent with your charity's charitable purpose. Number 3 and 4. So the third and fourth duties require that a responsible person does not use their position or any information gained from their position in a way that is improper. For example, if you gain access to confidential information in the course of your work as a board member, this must only be used for the purpose of informing any decisions that you make on that board. Under the 5th duty, a responsible person must disclose conflicts of interest. This means that a responsible person who has or may appear to have a material conflict of interest in a decision should tell the other responsible persons about it before the decision is made. Once the other directors are told about the interest, the charity may also need to take steps to ensure that this conflict of interest is managed appropriately. The 6th duty of a responsible person is to ensure that the charity's financial affairs are managed responsibly. This means understanding the charity's financial position and making decisions which will not endanger its financial health. This duty is not intended to discourage you from being innovative or taking risks, but rather to encourage charities to maintain appropriate financial systems and procedures to make sure that its ongoing financial sustainability is ensured. Finally, the 7th duty, responsible persons must ensure that their charity does not operate whilst it is insolvent. This means that the charity must be able to pay all of its debts when they are due. April, it may be worth explaining what level of financial literacy a board member should have to make sure that the requirements are met. Can you explain the 6th and 7th duties for us, please?
Generally speaking, a responsible person is required to have an understanding of financial concepts and financial literacy that will enable them to make informed decisions about a charity's finances. At the very least, a responsible person should be able to determine whether their charity is solvent and the impact that any decision is likely to have on its financial health. A responsible person is required to be informed about matters on which they will make a decision. They cannot make an informed decision about a charity's finances without an understanding of the financial concepts that relate to them. Of course, responsible persons can seek, and up to a point, rely on the advice of an expert, but they must not do so blindly. Responsible persons must have enough knowledge to question any professional advice they are given, recognize any inconsistencies, and identify any problems with the answer. Professional advisors play an important role within charities, but these duties require that responsible persons still question information when receiving advice. Of course, the amount of understanding required will vary depending on the complexity and size of a charity's finances. What would be expected of a charity with a very small budget would be different to the expectations on a responsible person for a charity with a multi-million-dollar budget. In the end, the financial knowledge must be reasonable for the circumstances of the charity. Consider the charity's nature, the scale of its operations, the complexity of its finances, and ask what financial knowledge would be needed to make informed decisions.
Thanks, April. Some of the other things the charity can do to make sure its responsible persons meet the duties in Governance Standard 5 are providing a letter of appointment to your responsible persons that sets out what their duties are under this governance standard. A letter such as this can also be a great way to set out any other expectations of board members. Many charities provide information to their board that will help them understand and meet their duties. There are a number of useful guides available which explain the duties in detail and how they apply to the responsible persons. You could also consider arranging training for responsible persons if required. And, of course, if responsible persons do not know their duties and are not meeting them, take action. So the members of a charity's board should feel comfortable openly discussing their duties and should hold each other to account for ensuring that they are met. Let's consider a case study on the duties of a responsible person. April is going to take us through this one.
We recently came across a charity that operated nationally online, which allowed them to raise funds in several different states and territories. It was alleged by one of the charity's volunteers that some of the money the charity raised was being made available as interest-free loans to the responsible persons. In our investigations, we found that this was indeed occurring. We determined that the charity's responsible persons were failing to ensure the charity's assets were put towards its charitable purpose. They failed to act in the best interests of the charity. In this case, instead of acting in the best interests of the charity, the responsible persons were acting in their own interest and using these assets for their own private benefit. As such, the responsible persons were failing to meet their duties.
The ACNC released a compliance report in 2015 which reflects on the lessons that we learned from the compliance activities in the period for 2012 to 2014. Governance is an underlying theme in the report. Almost 3/4 of the substantiated concerns related to breaches of the governance standards. Concerns raised with the ACNC range over a number of topics, but the three most common issues raised in cases that the ACNC sees are record keeping, where a charity has poorly organised, incomplete, or in some cases no records at all. Poor record keeping is a common indicator of a broader governance concern, but it can also raise problems by itself. For example, poorly kept records can make it difficult to identify and prevent fraud in charities. It can represent a major concern. Failing to meet the requirements of being a not-for-profit is also a recurring theme in compliance cases. These are the cases where we see in a private benefit or where charities are working towards purposes that are not charitable. And finally, failing to demonstrate accountability to members is also a common theme in the cases that we investigated. These issues are common for many of the compliance cases we encounter and could be useful indicators of more significant governance problems within a charity. As the ACNC continues to receive more information about charities through the annual information statements, we are building a better picture of the charity sector. We will use this information to proactively identify non-compliance in the future and help more charities to comply.
We know that charities often have questions about the governance standards. There is a lot of information available on our website on the governance standards and on all the obligations that registered charities have to the ACNC. I've included links on this slide to most of the information we covered today, but we will also have these links sent to you in the follow-up email. You will be able to watch this webinar as well in a couple of days' time on our website. The links here will take you to pages about the governance standards, the ongoing obligations of registered charities, governance tools, which include some quick tips and templates you can use, basic religious charities, the category we discussed earlier, So that's a special type of charity that is not required to meet the governance standards. Companies limited by guarantee, or CLGs, which we mentioned today in today's presentation, and the ACNC's compliance report, which Zane just spoke about. This provides information about some of the ACNC's work in compliance over the last couple of years. You may also be interested in our guide, Governance for Good, which explains some of the central concepts in governance and how they relate to charities. It's also available for download on our website.
If you'd like to get in touch, you can do so in a number of ways. So you can view our previous ACNC webinars and register for upcoming webinars at acnc.gov.au/webinars. You can call us on 13 ACNC, which is 132262. Our phone lines are open between 9 AM and 6 PM Australian Eastern Standard Time, and they're staffed by helpful people who understand the charity sector and can provide advice on how charities can meet their obligations to the ACNC. Our staff are trained to give general advice on a range of topics related to the regulations of charities. You can also email them at advice@acnc.gov.au. That's ADVICE@acnc.gov.au. This is a particularly good idea if your issue is complex or if you think it will need a detailed consideration. And, of course, we're active on social media, so you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and even YouTube.
And that brings us to the end of our webinar. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your questions. We hope that this has been useful to you and helped you further understand the governance standards. We are always looking for ways to improve our education products, and we would appreciate it if you took the time to let us know what you thought. If you have any additional comments, questions, or suggestions, you can get in touch with ACNC Education Team directly at education@acnc.gov.au. Well, that's it from Zane and me, and thank you to Anne and Carolyn for answering the questions. And thank you to you all for participating, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.